Wyatt set the hammer down on the porch railing. He had just finished the last piece of a house that had taken 3 years and every callus on both hands, and stood in the silence that followed. No pride came, only the echo of empty rooms at his back. He had built a table long enough for a family, a bedroom with an east window for morning light, shelves at 2 different heights without knowing why. He knew why now. "A house isn't a home," he said to no one. "To the dark land, to the stars over Montana. And I've been building for someone I haven't met yet." He saddled his horse before sunrise and rode toward town. If you've ever built something with everything you had and still felt empty when it was done, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The hammer had been in Wyatt Callahan's family for 2 generations. His grandfather had used it to build a cabin in Wyoming that still stood. His father had used it to repair fences on land that eventually got sold to pay debts. Wyatt had carried it across 3 states, slept beside it in a bedroll, and used it to drive the first stake into Montana ground on a morning so cold the air cracked when he exhaled. He was 29 years old when he started. He was 33 when he finished. 4 years. 4 brutal Montana winters. 4 summers of working from before sunup until his hands stopped functioning from exhaustion. He had dug the foundation himself, poured it himself, framed every wall set, every beam, laid every floorboard with the kind of attention a man gives only to something he believes will outlast him. He had done it all without asking anyone for help, not because he was proud though he was, but because there had been no one to ask. Now he stood in the main room of a house that could hold a family, and he was alone in it, and the silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. Wyatt walked to the window he had cut and framed himself. The glass had cost him more than he wanted to spend, but he had bought it anyway. He hadn't known why at the time. He told himself it was for light. He told himself a man needed to see the land from inside his own walls. But standing there at 4 in the morning with the darkness pressed flat against the glass, he understood for the first time what he had actually built that window for. He had built it for someone else to look through. He turned away from it. He walked through the kitchen, a kitchen with a stove positioned deliberately to catch the morning warmth with counter space on both sides, with shelving he had built at 2 different heights without consciously understanding why. He walked down the short hallway to the bedroom, which was larger than any single man needed, with a window on the east wall to catch sunrise. He had not built this house for himself. He had built it for a life he did not yet have. That realization sat on his chest like a stone. Wyatt Callahan was not a man who talked to himself. He was not a man who dramatized his own feelings or searched for meaning in ordinary things. He had been raised by a father who communicated in tasks you showed love by fixing what was broken, by being present when it mattered, by doing the work without being asked. But standing in the middle of that bedroom at 4 in the morning, Wyatt said something out loud for the first time in months. "What exactly did you think you were building this for?" The house did not answer. Houses never do. That was the problem. He went back to the main room, sat in the chair he had made from oak he had felled himself, and stared at the fireplace he had laid stone by stone. The fire had burned down to coals. He didn't rebuild it. He just sat in the cooling room and thought about something his grandmother had said to him when he was 11 years old the last summer before she passed. Wyatt. She had told him, pressing her rough hand against the side of his face with a tenderness that embarrassed him at the time, a house is walls and a roof. A home is what happens inside it. Don't confuse the two. He had been 11. He had nodded politely and gone back to whatever he had been doing. He was 33 now. He finally understood what she meant. He saddled his horse before dawn. Mrs. Adeline Pouet heard the horse before she saw the rider, which was how it usually worked when someone was coming from the Callahan property. The trail ran close enough to her land that sound carried in the mornings, especially in autumn when the wind moved in a particular direction. She was on her porch with coffee when Wyatt rode past, and she called out to him before he could pretend he hadn't seen her. "Wyatt Callahan, where are you headed at this hour?" He reined in. He was not a man who lied easily, and Adeline Puig had a way of looking at a person that made dishonesty feel more trouble than it was worth. She was 62 years old, had buried a husband, and outlasted 2 droughts, and her eyes had the particular sharpness of someone who had watched enough people make enough mistakes to recognize the early stages from a distance. "Silver Creek," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his saddlebag, which was packed for more than a single day. She looked at the way he was sitting, which was a man carrying a decision he had not fully made, yet pressing it down with the weight of his posture. "You finished the house," she said. It was not a question. "Last night." And he didn't answer immediately. He looked out past her property toward the distant line where the land met the sky, which was beginning to lighten just barely at the edge. "And nothing," he said finally. "It's finished." Adeline set her coffee cup down on the railing with a quiet precision that meant she was about to say something worth hearing. "You know what I notice about men who build things," she said. "They always know exactly when something is missing. They just don't always know what the missing thing is until they've been sitting in the quiet long enough." Wyatt looked at her. "I know what it is." "Then you're further along than most," she said. "Go on then. Silver Creek's a long ride." He touched the brim of his hat and rode on. She watched him until he disappeared into the gray morning, and then she picked up her coffee, and she allowed herself a small smile that no one was there to see. Silver Creek had a population of approximately 400 people, a post office, 2 dry goods stores, a bank with iron bars on its windows, a church that held services 3 times a week, and a social structure as rigid and layered as anything Wyatt had encountered in any city. He understood that within the first 2 hours of arrival. He had come without an announcement, which turned out to be the first mistake. In Silver Creek, a single man arriving from the outer territories and asking politely about, as he eventually had to word it, respectable women who might be open to conversation, was not treated as a practical inquiry. It was treated as an event. By noon, 3 separate men had approached him outside the livery to evaluate his character in the guise of friendly conversation. An older woman he had never met stopped him outside the dry goods store to ask, with a directness that startled him, whether he owned his land outright or was still carrying debt. When he told her he owned it free and clear, she studied his hands the way a rancher studies a horse's legs, and then nodded once and moved on without another word. He had not anticipated this. He sat in the small dining room of the only boarding house in town and ate a plate of food he barely tasted, and tried to recalibrate what he had imagined this trip would look like against what it actually was. He had imagined, he admitted this only to himself, that the process would be more straightforward. That he would arrive, find a woman of good character and practical sensibility, have an honest conversation about what his life offered and what it required, and proceed from there with mutual clarity. What he had not imagined was that he would feel within hours of arrival like a man being quietly audited. "You look like you stepped into something you didn't expect," said the woman who brought him more coffee. He looked up. She was perhaps his age, maybe a few years younger, with dark hair and an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not performing friendliness. She was looking at him with the direct evaluative attention of someone who found other people interesting as puzzles rather than as audiences. "I'm from outside town," he said, which was obvious, and he immediately understood it was the wrong thing to say. "I know where you're from," she said. "The Callahan property, out near the Puig Ranch. You finished your house." She said it the way people say things they know more about than they're letting on. He set down his fork. "You know Mrs. Puig. Everyone knows Adeline." She refilled his coffee without being asked and then did not leave, which was its own kind of statement. She mentioned the last time she came through town that her neighbor was building something substantial out on that land. She said, the woman paused, and something crossed her expression that might have been humor carefully restrained. She said he was building it for someone who didn't exist yet. Wyatt stared at her. "She said that to you." "She said it to Mrs. Hargrove at the fabric counter, which means she said it to everyone." She tilted her head slightly. "Adeline Puig does not share information accidentally." He was quiet for a moment. "And you are—" "Charlotte Bennett." She said it simply the way people say their name when they've decided it should be enough information on its own. "Wyatt Callahan." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Is there anyone in this town who doesn't already know why I'm here?" Charlotte Bennett considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "Probably not," she said. Small towns process new information quickly, especially when the information involves a solitary man who spent 4 years building a house large enough for a family and has now ridden 60 miles to town. She paused. The conclusions tend to draw themselves. "Does that bother you?" he asked. Being part of a conclusion people have already drawn. Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, but attention. She looked at him differently than she had a moment before, like a question had become more interesting than she'd initially expected. "It depends entirely," she said carefully, "on whether the conclusion is accurate." She took the coffee pot back to the kitchen. She did not look over her shoulder. She left him sitting with his food and the particular weight of a conversation that had ended before it finished. Wyatt Callahan had ridden 60 miles expecting to find a practical solution to a straightforward problem. Instead, he was sitting in a boarding house dining room thinking about the way Charlotte Bennett had said it depends entirely, with the measured, unhurried confidence of a woman who did not feel the need to perform an answer before she had thought it through. He stayed a second day. The second morning he found her at the bakery 2 doors down from the boarding house buying bread, for what she explained was a widow on the far end of the street who could no longer manage the walk herself. He did not engineer the meeting. It happened the way things happen in small towns, because there were not enough streets and too few hours in the morning for encounters to be avoided. "You're still here," Charlotte said. She did not seem surprised. "I have no reason to leave yet," he said. She studied him. "What would a reason look like?" "I haven't found what I came for." "And what exactly did you come for?" She said it without challenge. She was genuinely asking. He looked at her directly the way he looked at land when he was trying to understand its grade. An honest conversation with a woman who isn't performing anything. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific thing to come 60 miles for. I built a specific house," he said. She was still holding the bread. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at him the day before, with that particular attention that was neither warm nor cold, but entirely uncomfortably present. "The bench outside," she said. "An hour. I have an errand first." She walked away. He sat on the bench for an hour and 15 minutes before she appeared, and she did not apologize for the time, and he did not ask about it, and somehow that exchange communicated more than if either of them had spoken. The conversation on that bench was not romantic. It was not flattering to either of them. It was the kind of conversation that happens when two practical people decide to stop performing and start asking. Charlotte asked him first. "You said you built a house for 4 years. Alone. Alone. Why alone?" "There was no one to build it with." She considered this. "That's not the same as preferring to work alone." "No." He agreed. "It isn't." "What's the land like?" he told her. Honestly. He did not describe it as beautiful, though parts of it were. He described it as honest. What the soil held. What the winters demanded. What the summers allowed. How far the nearest town was. How far the nearest doctor was. He told her about the creek that ran reliable through spring and summer, and ran lower in fall. He told her about the season in his second year, when he'd lost 2 weeks of progress to a storm that destroyed the framing he'd spent 3 weeks building. She listened without interrupting. This was unusual enough that he noticed it. "What did you do?" she said. When he paused after the storm story. "I rebuilt it." "The same way." "Differently," he said. "The original way wasn't wrong, but I understood the land better by then. The second framing was better." She was quiet for a moment. Most men would tell that story to prove something about endurance. "I'm telling it because you asked what the land is like," he said. The land taught me things. That's part of what it's like." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "What are you actually asking me?" she said, quietly, directly. "I'm asking if you're interested in a real conversation about what a life out there looks like," he said. "Not a proposal, not a performance. A conversation. More than one, probably. Until we both know whether it's a thing worth pursuing. And if I decide it isn't, then I ride back and that's the end of it," he said. "I'm not here to persuade you of anything. I'm here to be honest and let you decide with full information." She looked out past the street for a moment. When she looked back, her expression had shifted in a way that was hard to name, not softened. Charlotte Bennett did not appear to be a woman who softened, but opened slightly, the way a window opens to check the weather. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Same bench, and I'll have questions." "I'll have answers," he said. She stood. "We'll see about that." She had questions. On the third morning she came with what felt like a list she had constructed the night before, though she held nothing in her hand. "What happens in winter when the road closes?" "You provision for it, 2 months minimum. I've managed 3. "What happens if someone gets sick and the road is closed?" He didn't look away. "You do what you can with what you have, and you accept that some things are beyond what any location can fix." She held his gaze. "That's honest. I told you it would be." Most men would have said the road isn't closed that often, or the doctor isn't that far. Both of those would be partly true and mostly dishonest, he said. The road closes. The doctor is far. Those are facts of the life. She nodded slowly. "What do you expect from a wife?" The question landed without ceremony. He thought about it for a real moment long enough that she could see he was actually considering it, rather than reaching for a prepared answer. "A partner," he said finally. "Someone who understands the life and chooses it deliberately. Someone whose judgment I can trust. Someone who will tell me when I'm wrong rather than manage around it. And in exchange, the same," he said. She was quiet. "Charlotte," he said. And it was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed. "I'm not looking for someone to fill a house. I'm looking for someone to build a life with. Those are different things." She stood abruptly, not from upset, he realized, but from the need to move to walk the way some people process thought by changing their position in space. She walked to the end of the boardwalk and stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned back. "I'll need to see the property," she said. "Before anything is decided. I won't choose a life I haven't looked at." "That's fair," he said immediately. "And I have conditions." "Tell me." She came back and sat down and looked at him with the clear, undeflected attention that he was beginning to understand was simply how she faced things she considered important. "I will not be decoration," she said. "I will not be managed or handled or redirected toward smaller decisions. I am either equal in the running of that life or I am not in it." "Agreed," he said, without pause. She watched him, looking he understood for the hesitation that hadn't come. Most men agree to that in conversation and revise it in practice. "Then they weren't agreeing," he said. "They were managing." Something passed through her expression, not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Something that felt more important than a smile. "I want to speak with Adeline Puig before I go anywhere," she said. "She knows your land, and she knows you. She'll tell you the truth. That's why I want to talk to her." He stood. She stood. They were both standing on a boardwalk in Silver Creek in the early morning, and neither of them had made any kind of declaration, and somehow the weight of what had passed between them was heavier and more real than anything Wyatt had said aloud in years. "I'll send word to Mrs. Puig," he said. "When would you want to make the trip?" "Give me a week," she said. "I have obligations here." "A week?" he agreed. She nodded once. She walked back toward the boarding house. She did not look over her shoulder. Wyatt stood on the boardwalk and watched her go, and understood with the same quiet certainty he had felt the morning he drove the first stake into Montana ground that he was at the beginning of something that would require everything he had. The house was finished. What came next was harder. He sent a letter to Adeline Puy that afternoon. He wrote it the way he built, plainly, without decoration, with everything where it needed to be. He told her Charlotte Bennet would be coming. He told her to tell the truth about everything. He was not afraid of the truth. He was afraid for the first time he could name of something rarer and harder to build than any house, the chance of being genuinely known and chosen anyway. He rode out of Silver Creek the next morning into air that tasted like coming cold, like the first warning edge of the season turning, and he rode the 60 miles back to the house he had built in silence alone. But not, he thought, for much longer. Wyatt rode back into Silver Creek 6 days after he left it. He had not planned to return so soon. He had told Charlotte a week, and he had meant it, and he had spent those 6 days on his property, doing the work that always needed doing, checking fence lines, clearing the drainage channel along the north pasture, repairing a section of roof over the storage room that had developed a soft spot he hadn't noticed until rain came sideways off the mountain, and found the weakness, the way water always finds weakness. But on the 6th morning, he saddled his horse before he had consciously decided to, and he rode, and he did not examine the decision too closely, because he already knew what it meant. He had been thinking about Charlotte Bennet every day since he left. Not in the soft, distracted way a man thinks about a woman when he is trying not to. In the direct, practical, unromantic way, he thought about problems that mattered, turning the question over, examining it from different angles, trying to find where it was weak and where it held. Every time he examined it, it held. He arrived at the boarding house at mid-morning and was told by the woman at the front desk, a Mrs. Garfield, who had the particular manner of a person who managed other people's business as a civic duty, that Charlotte was not in. "She's at the schoolhouse," Mrs. Garfield said, and then added in the tone of someone who felt contextual information was important. "She teaches the younger children 3 mornings a week, has done for 2 years. Wyatt absorbed this. He had not known she was a teacher. He filed it away without comment, thanked Mrs. Garfield, and went to find coffee and patience in roughly equal measure. He was outside the bakery on the bench. The bench had already, in less than a week, become a location that meant something when Charlotte appeared at the far end of the street. She was walking with purpose, the way she did everything, and she had not yet seen him. He watched her for a moment, without meaning to, the way she carried herself straight without being rigid, like someone who had decided a long time ago not to apologize for taking up space. Then she saw him. She stopped walking. From 20 yards away, he could not read her expression with precision. What he could read was that she was not performing a reaction. Whatever crossed her face in that moment was genuine, and then it was managed, and she resumed walking. "You said a week," she said when she reached him. "It's been 6 days. That's not a week." It's close enough that the difference seems worth discussing. She looked at him with that measuring attention he was beginning to expect. "Why are you back early?" He thought about giving her a practical reason. He had several available. None of them were true. "Because 6 days was as long as I managed," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She sat down on the bench without being invited, which he had also come to expect. Charlotte did not wait for invitations to do things she had already decided to do. "I spoke with Adeline," she said. He waited. "She told me things about your land that you didn't tell me. Such as, the winter you lost the cattle." She said it plainly, watching his face. 4 years ago, before you started the house. She said you lost nearly everything and didn't tell anyone until spring." He was quiet. It was not a comfortable quiet. "Why didn't you tell me that?" Charlotte asked. "You asked about the land," he said, "not about my failures." "Your failures are part of the land," she said. "What happened to you on that land is information I need. You said you'd give me full information." He looked at her. She was right, and she knew he knew it, and she wasn't pressing the advantage, she was just holding the truth steady between them and waiting for him to pick it up. "I lost 37 head in 6 weeks, he said. "Fever that moved through the herd fast. By the time I understood what was happening, there wasn't enough left to recover easily. I spent 2 years rebuilding the herd. It nearly finished me financially. It did finish me emotionally for a while." "What does that mean?" she said. Finished you emotionally. It means there were months I wasn't sure why I was still there. He said it without drama, the way he would have said the temperature dropped or the creek ran low. I didn't leave, but I understood during that time why men leave. She absorbed this. Her expression did not shift toward pity, which he was relieved by. What it shifted toward was something more like respect, the kind that comes not from hearing about strength, but from hearing about the limits of it. And you stayed, she said. I stayed? Why? He thought about it honestly. Because I had put too much of myself into that land to walk away and have anything left. If I left, I would have been leaving myself. She nodded slowly. Adeline said you were the most honest man she knew about the things that cost him something to be honest about. That's a strange compliment. It's not a compliment, Charlotte said. It's an observation. There's a difference. He almost smiled. He stopped it just short, but she saw it anyway. I have more questions, she said. I know. Some of them are going to be uncomfortable. Charlotte, he said, the comfortable questions don't tell either of us anything worth knowing. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully name. Then she said Sunday. I'll ride out with Adeline on Sunday to see the property. That's the arrangement. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she confirmed. In the meantime, I'd like you to do something for me. Ask. Stay in town. She said it carefully, like someone who had measured the weight of the words before using them. I want to see how you handle 3 days in a place where people are watching you and talking about you and drawing conclusions. What a man does when he's being observed tells me more than what he does in private. It was a test. She was not pretending it wasn't. He respected that. All right, he said. There will be people who try to discourage you, she said. Men who think a rancher from 60 miles out isn't a reasonable prospect. Women who think I could do better in town. People who are protective of me, and people who are just interested in the situation as entertainment. I expect all of that, he said. How you respond to it matters to me, she said. I won't be there for all of it. But this is a small town. I'll hear. He nodded. It was the most direct thing he had ever heard a woman say to him, and he found that instead of feeling manipulated by the transparency of it, he felt something closer to gratitude. She was telling him the rules of the game openly. That was its own kind of honesty. 3 days, he said again. She stood. Don't try to charm anyone, she said. It'll read wrong. Just be what you are. She walked back toward the boarding house. He sat on the bench for a while longer, watching the street, thinking about what being observed for 3 days in a town that had already decided to have an opinion about him actually required. It required, he concluded, exactly what she had said, just being what he was. That turned out to be harder than building the house. The first test came that afternoon. A man named Gerald Pratt found him outside the dry goods store. Pratt was somewhere in his mid-40s, well-dressed for a town this size, with the particular posture of a man who had decided early in life that confidence and authority were the same thing. He ran the land office, Wyatt would later learn. He had, it would also emerge later, an interest in Charlotte Bennett that predated Wyatt's arrival by approximately 18 months and had thus far produced no result. Callahan, Pratt said, as if they had already been introduced, which they hadn't. Gerald Pratt. I manage the land registry for this county. Wyatt Callahan. He shook the offered hand because refusing it would have been a different kind of statement than he wanted to make. I know who you are, Pratt said. Everyone does at this point. He said it pleasantly in the tone men use when they want something to land like friendliness and function like warning. How are you finding Silver Creek? Hospitable, Wyatt said. Good, good. Pratt looked at him steadily. You're out on the old Hendricks parcel, north of the Put Ranch. That's right. Beautiful country, Pratt said. Difficult country. Water situation out there can be unpredictable. The creek that runs through that property. He paused as if recalling something incidental. There have been some questions about the water rights in that corridor. Old survey conflicts. The kind of thing that can take years to sort through properly. Wyatt looked at him. The casual delivery of the information was not casual. Nothing about this conversation was casual. "I have documentation on the water rights," he said. "Original land grant, they're clear." "I'm sure they appear clear," Pratt said with the smooth agreeableness of a man who has practiced saying unpleasant things in pleasant ways. "These old documents have a way of being less clear once you get into the details. It's the kind of thing worth knowing about before making major decisions. Inviting people into a situation with unresolved complications." The implication was not subtle. Wyatt understood it completely. He also understood that responding directly to it was exactly what Pratt wanted, a confrontation that could be reported as volatility. He kept his voice level. "I appreciate the concern," he said. "If there are questions about my documentation, I'm happy to have them reviewed by anyone who has standing to review them." Pratt smiled. "Just being neighborly." "Of course," Wyatt said. They parted. Wyatt walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of the bed in his room and thought about water rights and old survey conflicts and a land agent who had an interest in Charlotte Bennett and had chosen to mention legal complications to a man whose property bordered a water source within 3 minutes of their first meeting. The next morning, Wyatt went to the small office of the county registrar and asked politely but specifically to review the survey records for the corridor running along the eastern edge of his property, including the creek. The clerk, a young man who was clearly not expecting this request and slightly unsure what to do with it, produced the records after a 20-minute search. Wyatt spent an hour reading them. The water rights were clear. The survey was unambiguous. There were no conflicts in the documentation. But there was something else. A filing entered 8 months ago by a company called Territorial Development Associates, requesting a survey review of water corridor access across several properties in the valley. Wyatt's property was included in the corridor. So were 4 others, including a parcel adjacent to his on the south side. The filing was signed in the capacity of local representative by Gerald Pratt. Wyatt set the documents down. He sat for a moment. He put the pieces in the order they belonged and looked at the shape they made. Pratt wasn't warning him about a problem. Pratt was creating the appearance of one. And whatever Territorial Development Associates wanted with water corridor access in this valley, it was not something that had been disclosed to the landowners affected. He thought about Charlotte. He thought about what she'd said. "I want to see how you handle 3 days in a place where people are watching you." He thanked the clerk, returned the documents, and left without showing anything on his face. That evening at the dinner table in the boarding house, he sat across from a man named Elias Thorne, a retired surveyor who had settled in Silver Creek 15 years ago and who had the comfortable authority of someone whose expertise people had come to rely on. Thorne had been watching Wyatt since his arrival with the particular attention of a man assembling his own conclusions. "You were at the registry today," Thorne said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "I was," Wyatt said, "looking at your survey. Looking at some filings that were brought to my attention." Thorne cut his meat carefully. "And what did you find?" "A company called Territorial Development Associates. A survey review request filed 8 months ago across several properties, including mine. Signed locally by Gerald Pratt." Thorne stopped cutting. He set his knife down with a precision that meant the casual portion of the conversation had ended. He looked at Wyatt with an expression that was no longer simply observational. "You found that on your own," Thorne said quietly. "It was in the records." "Most people don't know to look at the annexes." "I read the whole file," Wyatt said. Thorne picked up his knife again and resumed eating, but something had shifted in his posture. "How long have you been dealing in land?" he asked. "My whole life." "Then you understand what a water corridor survey review means for landowners in an affected area. It means someone wants access to the water, and they're using administrative process to establish a legal path to challenge existing rights." Thorne looked at him. "You're not what I expected when they said a rancher from 60 miles out had come looking for a wife." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to manage," Thorne said plainly. Then after a pause, "There are 4 other landowners in that corridor. None of them know about the filing. Pratt's been in town 3 years and built a reputation as helpful and informed. People trust him because he presents information and they assume he presents all of it. But he doesn't. Not when it conflicts with whatever he's working toward. Thorne looked at him steadily. If you're going to stay in this valley, whether that's with Charlotte or without her, you should know what's moving through the land office. I intend to, Wyatt said. They finished dinner without speaking again, but the silence was the kind that follows two men recognizing each other as people worth knowing. Thorne pushed back his chair when they were done, nodded once, and left. Wyatt sat alone at the table for a moment. In 2 days, he had walked into a situation considerably more complex than a man coming to court a woman in a small town. He had found a land agent working against the interests of the valley's property owners, a filing that threatened water rights across multiple ranches, and a retired surveyor who had just in his measured way offered something close to an alliance. And he had done all of it while being watched. The third day brought the test he had least anticipated. A woman came to find him at the bench outside the bakery. She was perhaps 50, with the look of someone who had been handsome in youth and had translated it into authority in middle age. She introduced herself as Miriam Cross. Charlotte's former employer, Charlotte had worked in her seamstress shop for 3 years after arriving in Silver Creek from the east. I'll be direct, Miriam Cross said, sitting without ceremony. Charlotte Bennett is not a woman to be decided about quickly. I agree, Wyatt said. This seemed to momentarily disarm her. She recovered quickly. She came to this town after a situation in the east that cost her a great deal. I won't tell you the details because they're not mine to tell. What I will tell you is that she spent a considerable amount of time rebuilding herself, and she is not going to risk what she has rebuilt for a man who sees her as a practical solution to a domestic problem. I don't, he said. You've known her for less than 2 weeks. I'm aware. Then what exactly, Miriam Cross said with the precision of a woman who had considered this question at length, makes you believe you understand what she needs? He looked at her. He took his time. I don't believe I understand what she needs, he said. I believe she's capable of understanding it herself. I'm not here to offer her what I think she needs. I'm here to tell her honestly what I have and what I'm asking for, and let her decide whether that's worth her time. Miriam Cross studied him with an attention that was almost uncomfortable. Most men your age who come to a town looking for a wife have already decided what they want the wife to be. I built a house, he said. I don't have a wife to fill it. Those are different categories. A long pause. Charlotte told me you said that, she said, in different words. Then she's been talking to you about this. She talks to me about everything, Miriam said without apology. I am the closest thing she has to family in this town, which means I am telling you clearly, if you are not what you appear to be, you will not get close enough to her to cause damage. And if you are what you appear to be... She stopped. She looked out at the street for a moment. Then I suppose that's a different conversation. She stood. She straightened her coat. She looked at him one final time with the evaluating attention of someone completing an assessment. Sunday, she said. I'll be riding out with her and Adeline. He hadn't known that. He kept his expression neutral. I'll expect you all. She walked away. He sat on the bench and absorbed the information that the trip to his property on Sunday now included Charlotte's closest protector, in addition to his most perceptive neighbor, and that both of them would be looking at everything he had built, not just the house, but the choice he had made to build it, and drawing conclusions he would have no ability to manage. He thought about what Charlotte had said. Just be what you are. He thought about what Pratt had said about water rights. He thought about the filing in the land office and what it meant for 5 ranches in the valley. He thought about Elias Thorne's careful, deliberate decision to share information with a man he had known for approximately 2 hours. Silver Creek was not what he had ridden in expecting. It was smaller and more complicated and more alive with undercurrents than he had imagined, and every person in it was paying closer attention than they let on. And Charlotte Bennett, who taught children 3 mornings a week and had rebuilt herself from something she had not yet told him about, and talked to Miriam Cross about everything, was at the center of it, in a way he had only partially understood. That evening he wrote a letter. Not to Charlotte. to a land attorney in Billings named Prescott, whom Wyatt had worked with once before on a boundary dispute. He described the Territorial Development Associates filing. He described the water corridor. He asked Prescott to look into the company and tell him what it was and who was behind it. He sealed the letter and posted it before dinner. He did not know yet how consequential that letter would become. He did not know that the answer when it came would change the situation for every landowner in the valley, not just him. He did not know that what had started as a trip to find a wife had become something considerably larger and harder. What he knew sitting in the small room of the boarding house on his last night in Silver Creek before Sunday was this: he had come to this town as a man with a house and a question. He was leaving with the house still standing and the question still unanswered, but with something else added, a set of problems that were not his alone to solve, and the beginning of a strange specific confidence that when Charlotte Bennett rode out to see what he had built, she would not find only walls and a roof. She would find a man who, when he discovered something wrong, looked at the whole document instead of accepting the summary. He thought she might consider that worth knowing. He was right, but he would not find out until Sunday. Sunday came with the kind of cold that meant business. Wyatt was at the stable before dawn, checking the horses, making sure the trail back to his property was passable after the rain that had moved through on Saturday. He had ridden it once the day before to confirm the creek crossing hadn't risen too high and that the road through the pine corridor hadn't washed out. It hadn't. The trail was firm and manageable. He was not a man who prepared obsessively. He was a man who prepared completely and then stopped because everything after complete was just anxiety, wearing the costume of diligence. He heard them before he saw them. Adeline Puig's voice carried the way it always did, not loud, but with the particular resonance of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. She was talking to Charlotte about something he couldn't make out, and Charlotte was responding in shorter sentences, and Miriam Cross was saying nothing at all, which he had already learned meant she was observing. They came around the corner of the stable, and Wyatt straightened and waited. Charlotte looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, with full attention, without performance. She was dressed practically, which he noticed because it told him she had thought about what the day actually required, rather than what impression it might create. Adeline gave him a nod that contained a small private communication he didn't try to interpret. Miriam Cross looked at the horses first, and then at him, which was its own kind of assessment. "Good morning," Wyatt said. "You checked the trail already," Adeline said. It was not a question. "Yesterday." "I know. I saw the tracks." She gave him a look that was almost amused. "The creek." "Manageable, 2 feet below the crossing point." Adeline turned to Charlotte as if to say, "You see." Charlotte did not acknowledge it. She was adjusting her glove and looking at Wyatt with an expression he was beginning to read as her thinking face, the one she wore when she was processing information and had not yet decided what to do with it. "How long is the ride?" Miriam asked. Her first words of the morning. "Just over 2 hours at an easy pace," Wyatt said. "Then we should go," she said. And that was the end of the preliminary conversation. They rode mostly without talking for the first hour, which suited Wyatt because it gave him time to simply be present without the pressure of filling silence. He had learned that about himself on the land, that silence was not a failure of communication. It was sometimes the most honest form of it. Charlotte rode beside him, not behind, not ahead. Beside. He noticed that too. About 40 minutes out, she said without preamble, "Tell me about the winter you lost the cattle." He glanced at her. "Adeline told you?" "She told me some of it. I want to hear it from you." He told her. The whole of it this time, not the compressed version he'd given on the bench. He told her about the morning he'd found the first 3 animals down and thought it was something minor, something manageable. He told her about the week that followed when he understood it wasn't. He told her about the decisions he made, which animals to try to save, which ones were too far gone, the brutal arithmetic of limited resources and accelerating loss. He told her about the last night sitting in the barn in the cold, knowing the count and knowing it was finished. She listened without interrupting. "What did you do the next morning?" she said. "Got up, fed what was left, started figuring out how to rebuild." Just like that. There wasn't an alternative that helped anything. he said. Grief has its place. It just doesn't have an unlimited amount of time in a life that still has work in it. She was quiet for a moment. That's either very healthy or very dangerous, she said. Probably both, he admitted. Adeline told me once that I process things horizontally instead of vertically. I keep moving forward and carry the weight alongside me instead of stopping to set it down. Is she right? Usually. Charlotte looked at him. Do you know how to stop? It was a strange question. Not unkind. Genuinely curious. The kind of question that assumed the answer mattered. I'm learning, he said. She nodded slowly, as if that answer was more satisfying than a confident yes would have been. Behind them, at a distance that was clearly deliberate, Adeline said something quietly to Miriam. He didn't catch it. He didn't try to. The second hour passed differently. Charlotte asked about the land itself, not the hardships, but the rhythms. What a typical week looked like. What decisions came up regularly? What required immediate judgment versus what could wait? She was not asking dreamily. She was asking the way someone asks when they are trying to map a life they are seriously considering entering. He answered all of it. He did not soften any of it. When the property came into view, or rather, when the fence line that marked the beginning of it came into view, because that was the first thing you encountered. Charlotte straightened in the saddle. He felt the shift in her attention without looking at her directly. This is it, he said. How much land? 340 acres deeded. Another 60 I've been working under a grazing agreement with the territory. Water rights through the creek on the east boundary. The same creek Pratt mentioned. He looked at her sharply. She had said it without inflection, but she was watching him with full attention. You know about that, he said. Adeline mentioned you'd spoken with Elias Thorne at dinner. Thorne told Adeline you'd found a filing in the registry. A pause. Adeline tells me things she thinks I should know. Wyatt processed this. The information network in Silver Creek was faster and more thorough than anything he had encountered. And I want to know what you're planning to do about it, Charlotte said. I've written to a land attorney in Billings, he said. A man named Prescott. I've asked him to identify the company and the people behind it. She looked at him steadily. You did that before you knew whether I was coming out here. The filing affects 5 ranches in the valley, he said. It would have mattered regardless of what you decided. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted that same quiet internal movement he had seen on the bench in Silver Creek, the one that was not quite a smile, but was more important. They rode through the gate. Adeline and Miriam came up alongside them as they approached the house, and the 4 of them dismounted in front of it. Wyatt took the horses. He did not rush anyone toward the door or offer a presentation. He simply handled the horses and let them look at whatever they wanted to look at in whatever order they chose. He heard Miriam say something to Adeline in a low voice. He heard Adeline respond equally low. He could not make out the words. Charlotte had walked to the porch and stopped. She put her hand on the railing. His railing, the one he had stood at in the dark, and felt nothing, and she gripped it once, testing the solidity of it. It did not move. It would not move for 30 years if the wood was maintained. He had built it that way. She turned and looked at him. Show me the inside. He led them through. He did not narrate. He opened the door and stood back and let Charlotte and Miriam move through the rooms, while Adeline, who had been in the house before, leaned against the doorframe and watched the younger women with the patient attention of someone who has already done their own deciding and is now watching others arrive at theirs. Charlotte moved through the kitchen first. She stopped at the counter. She ran her hand along the surface, the length of it both sides. She looked at the positioning of the stove. She looked at the shelving which he had built at 2 heights, without ever having examined why, until the morning he'd realized what the house was really for. She turned to him. You built the shelves at 2 heights. Yes. Why? He looked at her. I don't know, he said. At the time I told myself it was practical. Different storage needs at different access points. He paused. I think the honest answer is, I wasn't building it only for myself, and I didn't fully understand that until later. The kitchen was quiet. Miriam was standing near the window. Her back was partly to him, but he could see enough of her profile to watch her expression process something it had not expected. Adeline from the doorway said nothing. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she moved on to the next room, and he followed, and the tour continued. The bedroom stopped her longest. She stood in it for a full minute without speaking. The east window. The space. The fact that it was larger than a single man's room had any practical reason to be. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the window and then at the rest of the room, and then at Wyatt, who was standing in the doorway, because it felt presumptuous to enter a room that she was thinking in. "You built this before you knew who you were building it for," she said, quietly. Not a question. "Yes. That's either optimism or arrogance," she said. "It might be both," he said. "But it's mostly faith. I believed the life was worth building toward, even when I didn't know who I was building it toward." She looked at him steadily. "Faith is a difficult thing to trust in someone else." "I know. Because it can look like certainty from the outside, and certainty in people has burned me before." There it was. The first edge of what Miriam Cross had called a situation in the East. He did not push at it. He did not ask. He waited. "I'm not certain," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not standing here telling you I know how this goes. I am standing here telling you I think it is worth finding out, and I am willing to do that at whatever pace and under whatever conditions make it a real choice, rather than a pressured one." Charlotte looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Then Miriam Cross spoke from behind him. He had not heard her come to the doorway. "Charlotte," she said in a tone that was careful and deliberate, "come see the table." Charlotte moved past him without a word. He let her go. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment by himself, and exhaled slowly through his nose and waited for whatever came next. In the main room, Miriam was standing beside the table he had built. It was a long table, longer than a single man needed, longer than two people needed, built with the proportions of something meant to hold a life that included other people. Extra leaves stored beneath it. Chairs he had made himself, 4 of them, with 2 more he had started and set aside without finishing, because something had stopped him before he completed them. Charlotte noticed the unfinished chairs immediately. "You stopped at 4, she said. "I started 6, he said. "I stopped. Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I realized I was building a life I hadn't earned yet. It felt presumptuous to finish the chairs." Miriam Cross made a sound. Not quite a breath. Not quite a word. Something between the two involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when something lands in a place they didn't expect. Charlotte looked at the chairs for a long moment. Then she looked at Wyatt with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not the measuring attention, not the careful evaluation. Something rawer than that. Something that was working to stay composed and mostly succeeding. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." She said them with the directness he had come to expect from her, but with an underlying steadiness that told him she had thought about every word. She would not be secondary in any decision that affected both their lives. She would handle the financial accounting of the ranch, because she was better at it than most men she had met, and she would not pretend otherwise. She would continue somehow to teach, even if that meant an arrangement with the county for occasional travel. She would not be cut off from Miriam or Adeline or any relationship she valued. And she would not, she said this last, and with the quietest intensity, she would not be a woman who disappeared into a man's life and lost her own in the process. He said yes to every condition, not quickly, not the way a man says yes to end a difficult conversation. He said yes to each one individually after a brief pause that showed he was actually hearing it, actually measuring it against his life, and finding it not only acceptable, but correct. When she finished, and after the last yes had settled in the room, she looked at him with something that was finally open enough to be close to vulnerable. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I know," he said. I need more time. You have it. The conditions aren't negotiable. I didn't treat them as if they were. She looked at him for a long moment. Adeline, who had come in from the doorway and was now sitting in one of the 4 finished chairs, with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable in other people's important moments, watched them both with eyes that missed nothing. There's something else, Charlotte said. He waited. The man in Silver Creek. Pratt. She said the name with a particular flatness that told him she had her own history with it. He came to see me 2 days before we rode out here. He told me you had come to Silver Creek because you were in financial difficulty, that the ranch was struggling, that the house was collateral for a debt you were trying to manage by finding a wife with resources. The room was very quiet. He told you that, Wyatt said. He told me that, Charlotte confirmed. She was watching his face with complete attention, not to catch him in something to see what he did with being accused. And, he said, and I already knew it was a lie, she said. I'd spoken with Thorne and Thorne had confirmed the property is free and clear. But I wanted to see what you did when you heard it. He held her gaze. He felt something move through him, not anger at Pratt, though that was there. Something more important than anger. The recognition that she had tested him the way he had been tested all week in Silver Creek, and that she had told him about the test openly afterward, and that this honesty, this willingness to show her methods rather than conceal them, was exactly the quality he had come 60 miles to find. What did I do? He said. You went still, she said, instead of reacting. Does that tell you something? It tells me you've had practice managing your response when someone tries to make you angry. She paused. The question is whether you learned that from discipline or from something harder. He was quiet for a moment. My father was a man who reacted, he said, loudly, quickly, to everything. I spent a long time watching where that got him. She nodded once, the kind of nod that closed something. Then she said, Pratt's filing, the one in the registry. I want to understand what it means for this land. And just like that, the conversation shifted from personal to practical, from the interior to the exterior, from what they were to what they were facing. He spread the relevant information across the table, the facts as he understood them, the timeline of the filing, what Thorne had confirmed, what he was waiting on from Prescott and Billings. Charlotte listened. She asked specific questions about the legal mechanism, about the timeline, about which other landowners were affected, and whether they knew. She asked about the water dependency across the 5 ranches, and what the practical impact would be if the corridor rights were successfully challenged. She was not asking because she was interested in the legal drama. She was asking the way she had asked about the ranch's winter management and the doctor's distance and the road closures, because she was evaluating whether this was a situation she could walk into and be useful in, or whether it was a situation that would consume more than it returned. He answered every question completely. At one point, Miriam said quietly, She does this. When she's trying to decide something important, she turns it into a problem to be solved. It's how she manages the feeling of it. Charlotte did not deny this. She said without looking up from the papers, It works. It does, Miriam agreed. And something in the exchange between them, in its ease, its familiarity, its complete lack of performance, told Wyatt more about who Charlotte Bennett was than anything she had said directly. She was a woman who had built in her own way a life from the wreckage of a previous one, who had found in a small town with a fabric shop and a schoolroom and a neighbor named Adeline, whom everyone knew, a kind of stability she had constructed with the same deliberate care that he had applied to every beam and floorboard of this house. She was not looking for rescue. She was looking for something rarer, an equal. The afternoon was getting late when Charlotte set down the last of the papers and stood and walked to the window of the main room, the window he had built for someone else to look through, and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the land. He did not speak. Neither did Adeline. Miriam had stepped outside some minutes ago with the tact of a woman who understood when a room needed to be smaller. Charlotte turned from the window. I'll need a week, she said, to make arrangements in Silver Creek, if I decide to come. He heard the conditional. He held it carefully. A week, he said. The conditions stand. They stand, he said. And the Pratt situation. She paused. If what Prescott finds confirms what you suspect, it won't stay quiet. It'll become public. It'll be difficult. I know. I want to know how it resolves before I make a final decision, she said. I'm not walking into a legal fight without understanding its shape. That's reasonable, he said. But I'm not walking away from it either, she said. I want you to understand that. Whatever Prescott finds, I'm not the kind of person who sees a problem affecting 5 families and looks the other way because it's inconvenient. Something settled in Wyatt Callahan's chest that had not settled there in 4 years of building. Something that had nothing to do with walls or roofing or the weight of a hammer. Charlotte, he said. She looked at him. I know, he said. I already knew that about you. She held his gaze for a moment that was neither long nor short, but simply full. Then she called out toward the door for Miriam and announced it was time to ride back before dark, and the moment folded itself into the movement of the afternoon. But it had happened. Both of them knew it had happened. The decision wasn't made yet. It would take the week she had asked for, and the letter from Billings, and one more conversation that neither of them knew yet was coming, the one that would force the question entirely into the open, and take the choice out of the realm of the hypothetical. But standing in the house he had built in silence, watching Charlotte Bennett button her coat and speak to Miriam, with the ease of someone finally allowing herself to imagine a different life. Wyatt Callahan understood something he had not understood when he drove that last nail into the porch railing at 4 a.m. He hadn't been building a house. He had been building an argument for the life he believed was possible, and for the first time, someone was genuinely listening. The letter from Prescott arrived on Thursday. Wyatt had been checking the post every morning since Monday, not because he was anxious. He told himself he was not anxious, but because information had a way of changing the shape of everything around it, and he preferred to know the shape of things as early as possible. He had continued working the property while he waited. He repaired the section of fence on the north boundary. He cleared the drainage channel completely. He stacked 4 cords of wood he had been meaning to stack for 2 weeks and kept finding reasons to delay. Work was what he did when the waiting became too loud. The letter was 4 pages written in Prescott's precise, unhurried hand, the handwriting of a man who understood that legal clarity required that every word earn its place. Wyatt sat at the table and read it twice without stopping. Then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the pages and looked at the wall. Territorial Development Associates was not a legitimate development company. It was a shell entity, a paper organization registered in a territory with loose oversight requirements, owned through a series of intermediate filings by a man named Caldwell Forsythe, a land speculator who had spent the previous decade acquiring water access rights across multiple territories through the same mechanism. Identify productive valleys. Find a local representative to file administrative review requests against existing water rights. Create the appearance of legal uncertainty. Then approach landowners individually with acquisition offers at prices substantially below market value, while the manufactured uncertainty suppressed the land's negotiability. The local representative in the Silver Creek corridor was Gerald Pratt. Thomas Forsythe, the name Wyatt had seen on one of the secondary filings and assumed was a partner, was Caldwell's brother. They had operated together across 4 previous valleys. In 2 of those cases, landowners had sold under pressure. In one, a family had lost their water rights entirely through a procedural default they hadn't understood was happening until it was completed. Prescott had attached documentation from the Territorial Land Authority and a note at the end of the letter that read in his careful way, "This is actionable." If the affected landowners present the evidence collectively, the filing can be challenged and likely voided. The key is collective action individually. Any one of you is manageable. Together, you are a different proposition. I would advise moving quickly. These processes have timelines. Wyatt folded the letter. He put it in his breast pocket. He saddled his horse and rode to Adeline Puite's property, which was the closest and which was where he started, because Adeline would understand the fastest, and he needed one clear head on his side before he started talking to anyone else. She was in the yard when he arrived, and she looked at his face before he said a word, and she said, "Sit down and tell me." He told her. All of it. She listened without interrupting, which was how Adeline handled information she recognized as serious. She went completely still and let it come in without filtering it through reaction. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 4 other ranches, she said. 4. Harmon to the south, the Breckenridge widow on the east boundary, the Tillman brothers on the north, and the McKee property, though McKee is elderly and his son runs it now. McKee's son won't understand the documents, Adeline said, not dismissively, simply as a fact that required accommodation. That's why we explained them, Wyatt said. She looked at him. You said we. Charlotte said she wasn't the kind of person who sees a problem affecting 5 families and looks the other way, he said. I believed her. Adeline sat with that for a moment. Then, you need to go to Silver Creek. I need to go to Silver Creek, he agreed. But I wanted you to know first, and I want you to ride with me. You know these people. They'll hear it differently from you than from me. She studied him. You rode out here before you went to Charlotte. You're closer, he said. That's true, she said. It's also not the whole reason. He was quiet. You're not sure how she'll respond, Adeline said, not unkindly. You built something with her in the last 2 weeks. You don't want to break the frame of it by bringing her a crisis before she's decided. It's her right to know, he said. She asked to know before she decided. I'm going to tell her. But you wanted to think it through with someone first, Adeline said, before you handed it to her. He looked at the older woman and didn't argue because she was correct, and they both knew it, and Adeline Puit did not require people to perform emotions they weren't having. Give me 10 minutes, she said, and went inside to get her coat. They rode to Silver Creek together. Adeline talked through the 4 landowners as they rode their temperaments, their financial situations, their likely responses to being told they had been targeted by a speculator who had spent months working quietly to destabilize the value of their property. Harmon was stubborn but fair. The Breckenridge widow, whose name was Ruth, was sharper than people credited because she was quiet. The Tillman brothers would be angry, which was manageable if the anger was directed correctly. McKee's son was nervous by nature and would need reassurance before he could think clearly. Wyatt listened and memorized. He asked 2 questions. Adeline answered both thoroughly. By the time Silver Creek came into view, he had a working understanding of the human terrain he was about to navigate, which was the kind of preparation that mattered. Charlotte was at the schoolhouse. He knew her schedule now. He and Adeline went to Miriam Cross's shop and waited, and Miriam read the room when they walked in and said nothing beyond offering them coffee, which she produced with the efficiency of someone who understood that serious conversations required something to do with your hands. Charlotte arrived 20 minutes later. She came through the door already reading their faces, and she set her bag down on the counter and said, The letter came. Thursday, Wyatt said. Tell me. He told her. He gave her the same account he had given Adeline, the same level of detail, the same completeness. Miriam stood at the counter and listened. Charlotte sat perfectly still the way Adeline had, and let the information arrive without interrupting it. When he finished, she looked at the letter which he had placed on the counter between them. May I read it? He pushed it toward her. She read it once. Then she read the attached documentation, moving through it with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to processing written information quickly. When she finished, she placed it back on the counter and looked at Wyatt with an expression that was controlled, but contained something underneath that was not quite controlled. He came to me, she said. Pratt. He told me your ranch was financially unstable. He was trying to create distance between us specifically so that if you tried to fight the filing, you would be doing it alone. The room absorbed this. He knew you were considering the property, Wyatt said. Small town, she said in a flat tone that was its own kind of anger. He knew everything within 48 hours of your arrival. She looked at him. He used me. He used what he assumed was a developing connection between us as a tool to isolate you. He underestimated you, Wyatt said. He underestimated both of us, she said. She picked up Prescott's letter again, not to reread it, but to hold it the way people hold something when they are deciding what to do with it. Collective action, Prescott says. All 5 landowners together, Wyatt confirmed. He says individually, we're manageable. Together, we're a different proposition. He's right, Charlotte said. She set the letter down. Who have you spoken to? Adeline, now you. No one else yet. The others need to know today, she said. Not tomorrow. Pratt will find out you've been to Billings he probably already knows. The moment he understands you have documentation, he may move the timeline. I thought the same, Wyatt said. Then we need to go now. She looked at Miriam. Can you send word to Ruth Breckenridge? She'll trust a message from you faster than from anyone else. Miriam was already reaching for paper. I'll have someone ride out within the hour. Ask her to come into town tomorrow morning. Tell her it's important and it concerns the water corridor. Charlotte turned back to Wyatt. The Tillman brothers' Adeline should come with you to talk to them. They know her. We already discussed that, Adeline said with a faint satisfaction at being ahead of the conversation. McKee's son, Charlotte continued, thinking aloud. He'll panic if it sounds like a legal battle. Frame it as protecting what's already his, not fighting something new. The distinction matters to people who are afraid. Wyatt looked at her. She had taken 13 minutes to go from hearing the problem to actively solving it, and she had immediately identified the human elements that the legal documentation alone couldn't address. He had known from the bench outside the bakery that Charlotte Bennett's mind worked with particular speed and clarity. He was seeing it in full operation for the first time. Charlotte, he said. She looked at him. You said you wanted to understand the shape of the legal fight before you made a final decision. I did say that. You've seen the shape now. She met his eyes. Something moved across her expression, not uncertainty, the opposite of uncertainty. A kind of arriving the way a person looks when they have been walking toward a decision for a long time and have finally reached the place where it becomes unavoidable. I'll need 3 days to arrange things here, she said, after the meeting with the landowners. He was careful with his voice. Arrange things. Miriam will manage the shop. I'll arrange substitute instruction for the school. I'll need to pack what matters and make arrangements for what doesn't. She looked at him with the directness he had stopped trying to anticipate because it always landed somewhere he hadn't expected. I'm not making a final announcement in the middle of a crisis. But I'm also not leaving you to handle 5 landowners, a corrupt land agent, and a speculator in Billings without someone who can read a legal document quickly. That's not a reason to, he started. It's not the only reason, she said. Don't be obtuse. Miriam Cross, writing her letter to Ruth Breckenridge, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Adeline beside him said nothing at all, but he felt the warmth of her approval from 6 feet away. He did not say anything more. Some moments were better held than spoken. The meeting happened the following morning in the main room of the Silver Creek Town Hall, a space that normally hosted property auctions and community notices and the occasional visiting official from the territorial government. Wyatt had arranged it through Elias Thorne, who had more authority in the room than any title he held, and who had since their dinner conversation become an active participant in what was unfolding. Ruth Breckenridge arrived first 20 minutes early, which told Wyatt everything he needed to know about her. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with the self-possessed quiet of someone who had run a property alone for 6 years and had learned to evaluate situations without wasting time on performances of emotion. She read Prescott's letter, standing up, finished it, handed it back, and said, "What do you need from me?" The Tillman brothers. Frank and George, mid-40s, large men with their father's land and their father's tempers, which were significant, arrived together and were angry before they finished reading the documentation. Frank wanted to go directly to Pratt's office. George, slightly calmer, put a hand on his brother's arm and said, "Sit down and let the man finish talking." They sat. McKee's son Daniel arrived looking pale and asked 3 times whether his father's deed was at risk before Wyatt said calmly and specifically, "Daniel, your deed is not at risk. What's at risk is Pratt's ability to manufacture the appearance that it is. There's a difference, and that difference is why we're here." Daniel absorbed this slowly, then nodded and didn't ask again. Thorne presented the survey documentation himself because his credibility on that specific material was unimpeachable, and Wyatt understood that credibility is a resource to be deployed where it will be most effective. Charlotte sat at the end of the table and said nothing during the presentation. She had asked Wyatt the night before whether he wanted her to speak or to observe, and he had said, "Observe first," because the landowners were still calibrating who she was, and her authority would carry better after they had decided she belonged in the room. She had agreed without argument. But when Frank Tillman, after Thorne finished, looked around the table and said, "So what exactly do we do? Write a letter," with the contempt of a man who had had enough of process and wanted action. It was Charlotte who spoke. "You file a joint challenge," she said clearly and without hesitation. "All 5 properties, 1 filing supported by the Billings documentation. You're not writing a letter. You're using the same administrative mechanism they used against you, but with legitimate standing and actual evidence behind it." Frank looked at her. "And who are you?" "Someone who can read the relevant statutes," she said, "and who has already drafted the preliminary language for the challenge filing, which Mr. Prescott and Billings can formalize." She placed 4 sheets of paper on the table and slid them toward Thorne, who read the first page and looked up with an expression that rearranged itself from surprise into something approaching respect. "Where did you learn to write like this?" Thorne asked. "I worked for a land attorney for 2 years before I came west," she said. "I was not the attorney, but I read everything that went through that office." The room was very quiet. Wyatt had not known this. She had not told him. She had simply sat down the night before at the table in Miriam's back room and produced 4 pages of clear, organized preliminary legal argument and handed it to him that morning without announcement. He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him with an expression that was not quite challenge and not quite satisfaction. Something between them that knew they were both still in the middle of becoming legible to each other, and that this was not a problem. It was the whole point. Frank Tillman read the pages that made their way around the table. When they reached him, he read slowly, moved his lips once or twice, and then looked at Charlotte with a fundamentally recalibrated expression. "This covers all 5 properties." "All 5, she said. "Pratt can't pick us off individually if this goes in. Not once it's filed jointly. His leverage depends on isolation. Remove the isolation and the leverage disappears." George Tillman said, "What happens to Pratt?" "That depends on what Prescott finds about his disclosure obligations as the county land registrar," Charlotte said. "At minimum, there's a conflict of interest that should require his removal from the position. Beyond that—" She looked at Wyatt, a brief glance that carried a full conversation. "There may be grounds for more." The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it all, 5 landowners had agreed to the joint filing. Thorne would coordinate with Prescott. Ruth Breckenridge offered her lawyer in Billings as a second attorney on the challenge, which strengthened the coalition. Daniel McKee signed his name carefully, and then shook Wyatt's hand with both of his, the way people do when relief has converted itself into gratitude. Frank Tillman, leaving, stopped beside Charlotte and said without quite looking at her, "That was good work." It was the closest Frank Tillman came to an apology for how he'd initially received her, and Charlotte accepted it with a simple nod that did not demand more than it offered. The room emptied. Thorne stayed behind with Wyatt for a few minutes to discuss the next steps with Prescott's office. When Thorne left, it was just Wyatt and Charlotte in the town hall, and the table with its papers, and the particular quality of quiet that follows the resolution of something that had required a great deal of people to hold together. Charlotte gathered the remaining pages. She stacked them neatly. She did not look at him immediately, and he understood she was composing herself, not because she was emotional, but because Charlotte Bennett's composure was not automatic. It was chosen, and sometimes the choosing required a moment. When she looked up, she said, 3 days. I meant that. I know. The filing will go in before I leave town. I want to see it submitted. I'll wait, he said. She looked at him steadily. Wyatt. Yes. When I come out to the property, she said. "I'm coming to stay. I want to be clear about that. I'm not coming to evaluate further. I've done the evaluating." His chest did something complicated and quiet. He kept his voice even. "Then I'll finish the chairs." She looked at him without immediately understanding. Then she remembered the 4 finished chairs at the table, and the 2 he had left incomplete because it had felt presumptuous to finish them. Something moved across her face that was entirely unmanaged. Raw and quick and gone almost before it arrived, but he saw it, and it was the most honest thing he had witnessed in 3 weeks of honest things. "Yes," she said, quietly. "Finish the chairs." She picked up the papers and walked toward the door, and Wyatt stood in the empty town hall and understood that the house he had built in silence was as of this moment no longer only a house. It had become in the only way that actually counts, in the way that requires 2 people to choose it openly and completely a home. The chairs would be finished by the time she arrived. He would make certain of it. He finished the chairs on the 2nd day, not because he was rushing Wyatt. Callahan did not rush woodwork because rushed woodwork showed, and everything in that house was built to last longer than he would, but because once he sat down to finish them, he could not stop. His hands knew the grain of the wood, knew exactly where the piece had been left, and what it needed to become complete, and the work moved with the particular ease of something that had been waiting at the right moment to be done. He set the 6th chair at the table just before dark on the 2nd evening, and stood back and looked at the 6 of them together for the first time. It was a small thing. Functionally, 2 chairs. But standing there in the quiet of the house with the fire low and the table full and the chairs waiting, Wyatt felt something he had not felt the night he drove the last nail into the porch railing, the night he had stood in silence and felt nothing. He felt it now, not pride, something quieter and more durable than pride. He felt that the house was ready. Charlotte arrived on the 3rd day as she had said she would. She came with Miriam Cross, who was driving a wagon with Charlotte's belongings, and Adeline Puig, who had appointed herself official escort for reasons she did not explain, and no one questioned. The 3 women arrived in the late morning, and Wyatt was at the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the wagon, and he walked back without hurrying, because there was a difference between eagerness and readiness, and he wanted to meet her as the latter. Miriam pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Charlotte climbed down before anyone offered a hand, which was entirely consistent with everything Wyatt knew about her. She looked at the house for a moment, just a moment, the way you look at something you have been thinking about long enough that seeing it again requires a brief recalibration between the imagined and the real. Then she looked at him. "The filing went in yesterday morning," she said. "Prescott confirmed receipt by afternoon. Ruth Breckenridge's attorney has already contacted his office." "Good," he said. "Pratt knows," she said. "He was at the registry when Thorne submitted. Thorne said he went pale and left without speaking." "Let him," Wyatt said. She looked at him for a moment. "That's all you have to say about it." "He's not the story," Wyatt said. "He's a problem that's being handled. There's a difference." Something settled in her expression. She turned to Miriam. "I'll take the first load in." She lifted a trunk from the wagon bed, lifted it herself without asking, without waiting, and carried it toward the porch. Wyatt moved to take it from her, and she shook her head once, not impatiently, but clearly, and he stepped aside and held the door instead, which she accepted without comment. Miriam watched this exchange from the wagon seat and said to Adeline quietly, "They're going to be fine." Adeline said, I knew in September." September was before they'd met. "I know that too," Adeline said, and climbed down to help with the wagon. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, not in the way Wyatt had expected, not conflict, not collision of habits, not the friction of 2 strangers learning to share a space. The difficulty was subtler and more honest than that. It was the difficulty of 2 people who had each independently built lives around self-sufficiency and who now had to learn daily that self-sufficiency was not the same as stubbornness. Charlotte reorganized the kitchen on the 4th day. Not because Wyatt's system was wrong. He didn't have a system. He had a set of locations where things had ended up and stayed. But because a working kitchen required logic, and logic required intention, And Charlotte applied intention to functional spaces, the way Wyatt applied it to fence lines and load-bearing walls. He came in from the morning work and found things moved. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, locating what he needed by tracing her logic rather than his memory, and found that her logic was faster. He didn't say anything. That evening, she asked, "Does it bother you, the kitchen?" "No," he said. "It's better." She looked at him with a brief assessing attention, checking for the performance of agreeableness versus the reality of it. She found the reality because he was not a man who managed his responses. He had learned that from his father in the direction of its absence. "There will be things I change that you don't prefer," she said. "I want you to tell me." "I'll tell you," he said. "And there will be things you do that I don't prefer," she said. "I expect to tell you. I expect you will," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to what she was doing, and the conversation was complete, not because it had resolved everything, but because it had established the mechanism by which everything could be resolved, which was more valuable. On the 9th day, a letter came from Prescott. Wyatt read it at the table with Charlotte beside him, which was the first time they had read important correspondence together and which established without discussion that this was how it would be done going forward. Prescott had found more than Wyatt had asked him to look for. Territorial Development Associates had been cited in 2 previous territory filings for improper disclosure practices. The Forsyte brothers, Caldwell and Thomas, had a pattern that was now documented across 4 valleys. More critically, Gerald Pratt had accepted payments from Territorial Development Associates totaling $940 over 14 months while serving as County Land Registrar, a position that required legal neutrality, on exactly the kind of filings he had been facilitating. That was not a conflict of interest. That was fraud. Charlotte read the relevant section twice. She set the letter down. She said, "He needs to be removed from the position. The county commissioner has the authority." "Thorne knows the commissioner," Wyatt said. "Then Thorne needs this letter today." Wyatt looked at her. "You understand what this means for the challenge filing." "It means the filing is no longer just a challenge," she said. "It means the original filing by Pratt was made by someone acting fraudulently in a position of public trust. That voids it. Not challenges, it voids it." "Prescott said the same," Wyatt confirmed. "Then there's nothing to fight," she said. "There never was. We just needed the documentation to prove it." She stood. She was already thinking through the next steps. He could see it, the particular set of her expression, when her mind was running ahead of the conversation. "I'll write to Ruth Breckenridge. She should know before it becomes public. The others too." "I'll ride to Thorne," Wyatt said. They separated to their tasks without ceremony, without discussion of who should do what. The division had arrived naturally, each of them moving toward what they were best suited for, each trusting the other to handle their portion completely. It was the first time Wyatt understood in his body, rather than his mind, what partnership actually felt like. Not the idea of it, the fact of it. He rode to Thorne's property and back before noon. Thorne had read Prescott's findings and said 3 words, "Give me a week." Wyatt had given him the letter and ridden home. Charlotte had already written and dispatched letters to all 4 other landowners by the time he returned. She had also, in the remaining time, reorganized the storage shelving in the front room, in a way that was demonstrably more efficient than its previous arrangement, and had noted on a piece of paper 3 maintenance items she had observed that needed attention before the hard winter came. He picked up the paper. He read the list. Every item was correct things he had noticed and flagged in his own mind and not yet prioritized. She had found them independently in less than 10 days. He set the paper down. "How did you find the eave gap on the north side?" "I went up on the roof this morning to look at the flashing," she said without looking up from what she was writing. He processed this. "You went on the roof. The flashing was the logical next thing to check after I saw the watermark on the interior beam," she said. "I know how to climb." He stood for a moment. He made a decision not to say several things he could have said. What he said instead was, "The gap needs mortar before the first freeze. I'll do it tomorrow." "I already bought the mortar in Silver Creek," she said. "It's in the storage room." He sat down across the table from her. She continued writing. He watched her for a moment, this woman who had rearranged his kitchen and climbed his roof and drafted legal arguments, and written 4 letters to landowners before noon, sitting at the table he had built for someone he hadn't met yet. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. "I want to say something." She set down her pen. She gave him her full attention, which was its own particular thing. Charlotte's full attention was not a performance, it was a presence. "I don't know how to do this well yet," he said. "Living with another person. I know how to work. I know how to build. I know how to manage land and weather and hard seasons. I don't know." He paused, searching for the right word, not willing to use the wrong one. "I don't know how to do the in-between parts. The ordinary parts. I'm going to get them wrong sometimes." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm going to get them wrong too." "I know you are," he said. She almost smiled. "That's a more honest thing to say than most men would. I'm aware that most men would have said you won't get anything wrong." "And I would have known it was a lie," she said. "So it's better this way." She looked at him steadily. "Wyatt, I didn't come out here because I thought it was going to be easy. I came because I thought it was going to be real." She picked up her pen. "Real includes getting things wrong." He nodded. He got up and went to finish the afternoon work, and there was nothing dramatic about any of it, and that was exactly what made it everything. 3 weeks later, Gerald Pratt was removed from his position as County Land Registrar by order of the Territorial Commissioner following formal complaint filed by Elias Thorne, supported by Prescott's documentation and signed by all 5 affected landowners. The Commissioner issued a public statement. The Silver Creek Courier ran it on the front page. Territorial Development Associates withdrew its survey review request 4 days after Pratt's removal. The mechanism had collapsed without its local instrument. The water corridor rights across all 5 properties were formally confirmed and recorded by the new acting registrar, a younger man Thorne had recommended, who had no history with the Forsyth brothers or anyone connected to them. Caldwell Forsyth, operating from a distance, had apparently calculated that a valley where the landowners had documentation, legal representation, and were willing to act collectively was not worth the continued investment of a fight. He moved on to other territories, other corridors, other unsuspecting families who didn't yet have a Charlotte Bennett sitting at their table reading the full filing instead of the summary. Ruth Breckenridge came to the property 2 weeks after the resolution to thank them in person. She brought preserves and a practical directness that Wyatt recognized as a kind of kinship. She sat at the table with its 6 chairs and drank coffee and talked with Charlotte about the water management on the east boundary with the focused engagement of 2 people who both understood what they were talking about, and Wyatt listened and added when it was useful and stayed quiet when it wasn't. When Ruth left, she paused at the door and looked at the 2 of them, Wyatt standing by the fireplace, Charlotte at the table with her coffee, and she said, "You 2 make sense together, with the blunt satisfaction of someone who calls things what they are." After she left, Charlotte said without looking up, "She's right, you know." "I know," Wyatt said. The marriage happened on a Saturday in November, on the land Wyatt had built by hand with Adeline Puite and Miriam Cross as witnesses and Elias Thorne officiating in his capacity as Justice of the Peace, which was a role he held and had never once been asked to perform until Wyatt appeared at his door and asked him plainly. There was no ceremony beyond the ceremony itself. No spectacle, no crowd gathered to observe. Just the 4 of them, and the land, and the house, and the specific gravity of 2 people making a deliberate, clear-eyed choice in front of witnesses who had watched the whole of it unfold and knew exactly what they were witnessing. Charlotte wore a dress she had made herself, which was not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but was the dress she had decided was right for the day, which was its own kind of statement. Wyatt wore his good shirt and the jacket that had been in his family since his grandfather, and he had cleaned his boots with more attention than usual, and that was the full extent of the ceremony's concession to formality. When Thorne asked the words, they both said yes, without hesitation and without performance, and Adeline pressed her lips together in a way that was not quite crying, but was adjacent to it, and Miriam Cross made no attempt to conceal anything, which was for Miriam a significant departure from her usual composure. Afterward, they ate the meal Charlotte had prepared the day before, and Adeline talked too much, and Miriam talked precisely the right amount, and Thorne ate steadily, and said things that mattered when he said them, and it was ordinary and warm and completely real, and when everyone had gone home in the late afternoon, the house was quiet again. But it was a different quiet than the one Wyatt had stood in the night he finished the last nail on the porch railing. That silence had been the silence of something missing. This was the silence of something complete, the stillness that follows when everything that was supposed to arrive has arrived. Charlotte washed the dishes, Wyatt dried them. They had not discussed this division of labor. It had arrived the way things arrive between two people who pay attention to each other naturally, without negotiation fitting together the way pieces fit when they were shaped for the same structure. Miriam cried, Wyatt said. Miriam always cries when she's happy, Charlotte said. She just usually makes sure no one sees it. I saw it. She'll be annoyed about that for approximately 3 days, Charlotte said. Then she'll decide it was acceptable. He set a plate on the shelf at the height Charlotte would have built it if she had built it. He stood for a moment with his hand still resting on the wood. Charlotte. Yes. Are you all right? She stopped washing. She stood for a moment with her hands in the water and looked at the wall in front of her, and he could see the side of her face clearly enough to watch the thing that moved across it. Something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but occupied the same territory as both. The thing that moves through a person when they have been afraid for a long time to want something specific and have finally allowed themselves to want it and have found it real. Yes, she said, quietly. I'm very all right. She went back to washing. He went back to drying. The fire settled in the fireplace and the house held the warmth, and outside the land stretched in every direction under the winter stars, 340 acres of honest, demanding Montana ground. The first winter was not easy. Winters never were. The road closed twice for a week at a time. A section of fence on the north boundary came down in a storm and required 2 days of cold work to repair. One of the horses developed a lameness that took 3 weeks of careful management to resolve. The firewood ran lower than Wyatt had calculated by February, and he had to make 2 exhausting trips to the woodlot in weather that made every step an argument. But they managed it together. When the fence came down, Charlotte was on the other end of the wire before Wyatt had finished saddling his horse. When the horse went lame, she researched the condition methodically and applied the treatment with the same patient consistency she applied to everything she decided to do well. When the firewood ran low, she adjusted the household's use without complaint and kept 2 rooms warmer, and the rest of the house at whatever temperature the available wood could maintain, and did not treat it as a failure either his or theirs, but as information for next winter's preparation. By spring, Wyatt had a list. He had built the list over the winter in the way he built everything piece by piece, as each piece revealed itself to be necessary. It was a list of what Charlotte had shown him she needed, not because she had told him, but because he had paid attention. A better lamp at the desk where she read correspondence in the evenings. A wider counter in the kitchen for the administrative work she had taken on, not just their ranch's accounts, but it turned out Ruth Breckenridge's as well, because Ruth had asked and Charlotte had agreed and was better at it than anyone Ruth had found before. A shelf in the front room, at exactly the height where Charlotte set things, she was currently working on a height he had observed and noted without commenting. He built the lampstand on a Tuesday, the counter extension on a Thursday, the shelf on Saturday. Charlotte came in from the yard on Saturday and stopped. She looked at the shelf. She put a book on it, the one she was currently reading, which had been sitting on the table for lack of a place. And it sat exactly right, exactly where her hands had wanted it to go a dozen times. She turned and looked at him. He was standing near the fireplace, with his arms crossed, watching her in the uncomplicated way he watched things he found worth watching. "You measured where I set things," she said. "Yes." "You didn't say anything." "I was still deciding if I had the measurement right." She looked at the shelf again. She looked at him. "You had it right." Good, he said. She came across the room and stopped in front of him and looked up at him with the expression he had come to know as hers alone, not the evaluating attention, not the problem-solving focus, but the open, undefended version of Charlotte Bennet that appeared in moments she had decided were safe enough to be unguarded in. She put her hand flat against his chest. He put his hand over hers. Neither of them said anything, because the house said it for them in the warmth of the fire and the lamp on the desk and the shelf at the right height and the table with 6 chairs, 2 of which had waited to be finished until there was someone real to finish them for. The spring that followed was the best season Wyatt had worked in 12 years on the land. Not because the weather was easy, it wasn't, but because every hard day ended with the house full of another person's particular and irreplaceable presence. Because the problems were shared, which did not make them smaller, but made them more endurable. Because the decisions were made by 2 minds that respected each other enough to argue when arguing was necessary, and defer when deferring was correct, and had over 6 months of daily life learned to tell the difference. When the water rights confirmation came in the final official form from the Territorial Land Authority in April, a document that formally closed the corridor review and confirmed the rights of all 5 properties in perpetuity, Charlotte read it, made a note of the reference number in the ranch's legal ledger, and filed it in the folder she had established for exactly this category of document. Wyatt watched her do this from across the room. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "It's done." No celebration. She looked up at him with a slight expression that on anyone else might have been a smile, and on Charlotte Bennet was something more precise than that amusement with weight behind it. "We already won," she said. "The document is just the record of it." He thought about that. "That's a very particular way to see it." "It's the accurate way," she said. She filed the folder. She closed the cabinet. She turned to look at him with full attention. "Wyatt? We built this. The house was already here. What we built was the rest of it." He looked at her across the room that held everything they had made together. The lamp, the shelf, the table, the chairs, the ledger full of the ranch's history. In her handwriting alongside his own. The winter and the spring and the 6 months of ordinary hard days that had become without ceremony or announcement, the architecture of a life. Wyatt Callahan had once ridden 60 miles to find a bride. What he brought home was something that could not be found in any town, could not be chosen in any negotiation, could not be built by any single set of hands working alone. He brought home a woman who looked at a life and saw its full shape, hard seasons and honest work and problems worth solving, and chose it anyway, with both eyes open and all conditions stated, and never once made him feel that the choosing had cost her something she regretted. The house he had built in silence was silent no longer. And neither for the first time in a very long time was he.